They were kind of like, who is this disgusting hippie? He smelled and had long hair, was wearing flip-flops, and this was Xerox back in the day. You know, everybody wearing a blue shirt and a suit. Welcome to Telltales. I'm Mike Nicoletti. Every week, along with my co-hosts Jason Wallace and Hunt Lawrence, we bring you the cash flow memo. Get it at telltales.us. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to dive deep into energy, technology, and healthcare. So download the memo now and get started.
The following conversation is intended for informational purposes only. You should always do your own work to determine if an investment is suitable for you.
I'm going to do 5 minutes of macro without even referring to A, B, and C. The macro has to do with the risk premium in the oil market. But it goes beyond the risk premium of the oil market. And I think it could have outcomes or a similar outcome, not an exact outcome, but a similar outcome to the fourth quarter of 2008, where basically the capital markets just went missing. And investment banks, Lehman, the bankruptcy, Merrill Lynch had to be merged into B of A. Morgan Stanley had to be rescued by a Japanese trading firm. It seems to me I remember it was Mitsubishi. Goldman Sachs was okay, except they had this big forward position to AIG, and AIG wasn't okay. G Credit, believe it or not, wasn't okay. So they had to hustle legislation through the House and the Senate to provide a fund under the direction of the Treasury Secretary and I guess ultimately the President to go to the rescue of these things. Now, when that happened, everything went down. And, you would think that that would be the time to commit whatever liquidity you have. But when everyone is running for the hills, it's hard to commit liquidity. So what does that mean from an investment point of view? And the reason why I think it's going to happen is Exhibit A. I have some optimism there that the deficit comes from $2 trillion, the fiscal year that ends at the end of September, to $1.5 trillion. That's based on hopefully lower interest rates, because that's a big expenditure. That's based on tariff revenues of a couple $100 billion revenues, and based on working hard on some of the healthcare costs. Because of course, that's the big spending item, other than defense and interest and Social Security. So that's optimistic. At some point, there'll be a problem. Now, the problem, everyone always says a bond auction will fail. But I think the problem's more likely to be in the repo market. Every financial institution, JP Morgan is our largest, every bank, every investment bank, at least half the balance sheet is borrowed every day on a daily basis in the repo market. The source of funds in the repo market are money market funds. And the people in charge of the money market funds have one thing on their mind: don't break the buck. In other words, they stand ready to redeem at $1 and don't get in a situation where that can't happen. So when they get really concerned by the way events are going, they don't have to call along. If it's in a repo market, if they've lent money on today, on Wednesday, and they're nervous, they can just not lend money on Thursday. And what happens is the repo interest rate trades on top of the Fed funds rate, the Fed policy rate. And what will happen is they'll start to trade for, if the Fed funds rate is 4% or 4.25%, they'll start to trade at 10% or 11% or 12%. Because the people that need to have that loan will just bid for it. And generally what happens is the next day the Fed comes in and provides liquidity in the repo market, and it somehow goes down. But it's a sign of trouble. Now, is there anything macro that could trip this off other than the fact that, just unable to roll our debt or raise enough money to cover the deficit? And it's not just the U.S. deficit. The Japanese, measuring deficit to GNP, have twice as much debt as we did. I mean, we're a little more than 100% of our GNP. They're 200%. I mean, Germany and the rest of Europe's been more conservative, but now they're going to spend extra money to stimulate their economy and try to get their defense spending up as a percentage of their GNP. Question is, what about China? China's government, federal government, looks pretty good from debt coverage by GNP, but of course they have debt in all the provinces and state-owned enterprises and whatnot. So if you did a proper consolidation of China, it would probably look about like us. So with that amount of borrowed money in our economy, in Japan, in China, and Germany always resisted doing this because they're fearful of inflation. With Germany ready, the new government, the Merz's government, ready to, spend, to deficit spend, eventually Germany, kind of linchpin of Europe, will get that way. I mean, my goodness, Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal were that way. I mean, remember, just a few years ago, it looked like Greece was going to have to declare bankruptcy. Italy, Spain, as I say, the Club Med part of Europe were all, and it was the European Union that, kind of came to the rescue, saying that, it will not happen. We will stand behind these countries. And some of these countries have made significant progress, certainly Greece and Italy. But I don't see the progress being made here. I don't think the Trump administration will go with another reconciliation bill, which only needs 51 votes in the Senate. They got so beaten up when they went with the $9 billion. So I don't think they're going to do that because they're too worried about the impact in the midterms. So we just won't do it, and we'll wait until the market speaks. Now, I know between Mike and Jason really believes, I would say Jason believes 120% in what I just outlined. So we'll ask Jason first, and then we'll get Mike's back up.
Absolutely concerned. I've heard that argument that, Japan's running their deficits at 200% GNP, so we shouldn't be as worried here, but we're the largest economy, and in not in relative terms, someone's got to buy that debt. So I think it is a problem. And these rescission bills that you brought up, they're just a drop in the bucket. It would eat up all their time if they went through and did these one by one to the extent that they need to bring it down. I guess I've come back around to an opinion that they should just use a blunt instrument, and every department takes a 7% cut. And at that rate, you would get to just $1 trillion in deficit spending. So maybe more sustainable there. I have a hard time believing there's not 7% bloat in every government agency after having spent a decade working with them.
Now, Mike will be the more optimistic of the three of us on this not happening.
Well, here's my point of optimism. In June, we had our first budget surplus since 2015, and we generated tariff revenues of $27 billion. So there are positives mixed in with the negatives here, and the thing about a debt spiral is, what is the tipping point at which it's no longer capable of coming back? And we don't really know the answer to that at this point.
Well, in the fourth quarter of 2008, it took Congress, I forget what the amount was, but appropriating whatever they thought was necessary, and forget what they called the agency, but I think it was part of $1 trillion that was available.
TARP, right? The troubled asset.
TARP.
Yep.
Yeah. So, and the congressmen and the senators did not want to vote for it, but they had no choice. So anyway, enough of macro, and I don't want to scare anyone out of positions. Remember, the best thing to be in, what governments typically do is they inflate their way out of this. So the best thing to be in is companies that don't have too much debt, that generate more cash than they use, that increase their dividend every year. I mean, you may, in an event like the fall of 2008, you may have your equity portfolio written down, but your companies will be fine. In fact, they'll come through a period like that stronger because they'll pick up market share because they're in good financial condition.
Assuming you're in companies that have good cash flow characteristics and will sustain through the drawdown.
exactly. Well, now having done this macro stuff, we've burned through 10 minutes. I think we need to go to software history, so we have time to do healthcare in the first 4 or 5 pages by the end of the 30 minutes. So over to you guys for software history.
Yeah, so where we left off last time, we were talking about the first generation of programming languages. They're compilable to run on different sets of hardware. So software becomes portable. And then we discussed the invention of the C language and with C, the creation of Unix. So one of the first real modern operating systems.
So we should talk about operating systems real quick, just because it is an important piece of software. And the history of operating systems goes back before Unix. So we talked about IBM in the semiconductors piece because they were very integral to the mainframe era of computing. And in doing research for this episode, I sort of stumbled on, okay, so you had Thomas Watson Sr., who was kind of the main leader of IBM through the punch card era. And what was really unique is that after his successor was his son, Thomas Watson Jr., and he is responsible for really bringing IBM into the digital age. He was a fighter pilot in World War II and was convinced that digital computing was the future. And he wasn't wrong. You know, their second generation mainframe computer that they sold to governments and enterprises and whatnot, they invested apparently $5 billion, more than what the moon landing cost the U.S. government. So the amount of money is, you know, if you look at in that point in time, is just incredible.
So a precedent for like modern time.
Right, exactly. It's like, so we think now like these numbers are just unfathomable. Well, can you imagine what people were talking about IBM? They were probably talking about IBM the way we talk about Google, in that they just have so much cash flow, they can invest it wherever they want to. But they were right. And those early computers that they released, they also released the source code with those computers. And that source code, the customers were encouraged to modify it for their own purposes. And the use case for the first operating system really came to be because these gigantic computers, which cost $2 million, I think, in late 50s, early 60s dollars, the companies wanted to utilize them as much as they possibly could. So General Motors actually wrote an operating system that would enable them to queue and batch jobs. So that way the computer was working as much as possible. And in a way, open source software sort of kind of gets started there, because at that point, the IBM in particular, not really attributing a lot of value to the software and recognizing the fact that customers would have to modify the software in order to make it work for their purposes.
So when companies like GM start writing software, it's really moved beyond research or niche projects into it needs some engineering rigor applied to programming software. So in 1968, that was the first time the term software engineering was used. So a lot of innovation then from the 70s and into the 80s for software engineering was around process and techniques, and some of the important ones that were created were called the waterfall software development methodology. It's kind of despised today, but it's still used in some industries that require further engineering rigor in software development. Also, version control was invented, and object-oriented coding principles were created then.
Wasn't C++ like the first?
C++, yeah.
So that's what Jason and I learned when we were in high school.
Yeah.
We were in the same computer science class together, so...
So those early software engineer teams started to think about how they can make this new era of PCs that was really coming about in the 70s and 80s more accessible to common people. And a huge innovation was out of Xerox at the time. And it's later been nicknamed the WIMP interface. So that's windows, icons, menus, and a pointer, which became the mouse interface. But that early Xerox PARC machine was an extremely expensive computer. So it wasn't really widely adopted at all. Around that same time, in 1979, a guy named Steve Jobs picked up on this concept and thought if he could build a computer...
He didn't just pick up on the concept. He went to Xerox and got a tour.
Oh, yeah. He
So one of my business school...
Picked up his...
Yeah. So one of my business school... I went to the University of Rochester for business school, and one of my business school professors worked for Xerox at the time when Steve Jobs came in to the building, and he talks about how they were kind of like, who is this disgusting hippie? He's like smelled and like had long hair, was wearing flip flops, and I don't know. It was just like this. This was Xerox back in the day of being like, everybody wearing a blue shirt and a suit, and yeah, very, very different cultures. But yeah.
So he borrowed this idea of a graphical interface to interact with a computer, and thought if he can make a computer cheap enough, kind of normal people would purchase it. And he had this vision that everyone would be using a computer to do their calculations, their spreadsheets, bookkeeping, writing papers, just writing in general. So he created the Apple Lisa computer at the time, and that got released in 1982 or 3, and it was the first kind of consumer Windows-like interface. It was all in black and white, and it was a mild success. But really, in that era, the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, the real winner in consumer computing devices was the Commodore 64. So this ran a software interface that was still command line.
Did you have one of these?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, so did I, yeah.
It was all command line interface. So to the average person today, that would look like you're writing programs in order to just make this thing work.
Mm-hmm. But it actually came with books and stuff that you could write your own, like games, and have it like display images using ASCII characters and.
Absolutely.
It was something that, like a kid, once you start playing with it, it was like, oh, what can I make it do next?
Yeah. So the Apple Lisa product was mainly used by professionals to do. They had a calc and a write, I want to say it was called, programs that shipped with it. The Commodore was mainly adopted by kids that wanted to play games. So it became the more popular system. But these were consumer devices that had to have software shipped to them. And that early distribution network for software was floppy disks. Like you went to a computer store, an electronics store, and you bought floppy disks. And applications sometimes came on a series of disks because they could only hold a couple megabytes. Also, I guess during that time, point out that there was someone else named Bill Gates at the time building software. He was releasing his first operating system, as we explained back in the semiconductor series, that IBM contracted him to create the first operating system. So he was building an MS-DOS at the time.
So IBM, basically because of Watson Jr., became a leader in the mainframe era. But they sort of, at the end of his career, when his health was failing, the mini computer era came to be. And we talked about that in the semiconductor segment. So the CEO that followed him recognized that the world was like the Lisa had already come out, so they recognized that personal computers were the next thing. So they had a skunkwork project, and in order to put it all together, they basically designed an open architecture. They got Microsoft to write DOS for it, and the interesting thing was they had nothing proprietary of their own in it. It was a great achievement, but it wasn't a great business decision for IBM.
Yeah. So the early Microsoft team saw these innovations by Xerox and Apple around graphical interfaces and really thought that was the future of computing. As such, they started working on what became Windows. They had a couple iterations of that, but where it really took off was when they released Windows 3, 1990, and it was a fully re-engineered operating system from their first processes. So it wasn't built as an interface on top of their early DOS system. It was a rebuilt, ground up graphical operating system. And the timing was really perfect because this coincided with the start of the proliferation of affordable Intel-based PCs, and this had the full color Windows, experience that we know today.
In every race, a story unfolds on the water. A story of grit, speed, and the dream of Olympic glory. For years, American sailors chased that dream across oceans. Now, the race comes home. Introducing the top MARC rankings. See who's leading the charge to LA 2028 and follow the journey of the top competitors. We're leveling the playing field for Olympic-class sailing. Whether you're a seasoned Olympian or a young laser sailor with big ambitions, this is your circuit. From North America's waters to the Olympic podium, it starts here. Join us, follow the action, and catch the next sailing superstar on their journey to the top. Top Mark Rankings, where Olympic dreams set sail, powered by Top Mark Capital.
How about healthcare news, Jason? Anything worthwhile to catch up from last week?
Yeah, I'll start with my favorite topic of big pharma sticking it to PBMs now. Yeah, I think the pharma companies are tired of being blamed for the high drug prices. So several of them have already launched direct-to-consumer offerings, and it's mostly around their blockbuster drugs, the most popular ones. The latest one is Roche. The difference here is the Roche CEO has become very vocal about where drug sales revenue goes. He says half of it goes directly to the PBM. He's being vocal now that if you cut out that PBM middleman, the drug spending gets cut in half. They've launched their own direct-to-consumer. And specifically around that is a treatment for multiple sclerosis that their direct offering is now 25% below the current standard of care. And it wasn't being sold because the PBMs priced it at a much higher price point. News this morning out of the FDA was the either resignation or removal of maybe the most controversial pick from under HHS, Vinay Prasad. He's out of the FDA now. He was very outspoken against a lot of emerging therapies, gene and cell therapy, for example. And at the time of his pick, we had pointed out that his opinions ran counter to much of the other leadership that was put in place at the FDA. We kind of said, maybe the market was overreacting to that. And now, just a couple months in, he's already out. What really maybe spurred that is a couple decisions the FDA, or actions the FDA has taken recently with Sarepta and Replimune. So two companies that have new treatments that they're trying to put to market, and they're each kind of interesting stories. There's a little controversy with both of them, but even though Vinay, his actions might not have been 100% incorrect, it might have shown where they were butting heads with the rest of the team at the FDA. So he's out, and it's largely seen as a positive that'll make it easier for new drugs to receive approval. I guess the last thing is a comment on Novo Nordisk. They lowered their growth targets for the year, and the shares really got hammered yesterday for it. They're now targeting a growth rate of 10% rather than close to 20%, and their free cash flow is going to be down significantly. Some things there is they're being outcompeted by Eli Lilly. There's a lot of competition on the horizon for new versions of GLP-1 drugs. This company's valued almost entirely now at this point based on Ozempic, I think. And one of the key things is still in the US, the compounding pharmacies are still allowed to infringe on their IP, which is kind of interesting. We haven't taken action there. They're pretty upset about it. So it's kind of an interesting story we keep watching.
Told you so. We've been kind of harping on the fact that a lot of competition is coming for that market, and there's a lot of IP that's either already rolled off or is rolling off. So, yeah.
On page one, I to Jason know in private and during the podcast, I complain about the valuation of Tesla, which is, the seventh company in Magnificent Seven. And people tend to say maybe it's a Magnificent Six. But Tesla pulled off a deal this week that I think shows the highest and best use of Musk is back at work, not trying to help steer our federal government. And that is a deal with Samsung, where Samsung is going to spend lots of money, several $billion dollars, building a foundry nearby in Austin, where Tesla is headquartered and where they have their newest and probably best car factory. And Musk said, and I'm sure Samsung anticipates, that it's close enough to his house, so he'll be there all times of the day and night, making sure that the construction of the fab and the operation of the fab and whatnot is as efficient as possible. And apparently Tesla has designed, or turn this over to Mike and Jason, but Tesla has designed their own chip, so they like Google, who has their own chip, and Amazon. Tesla would be equipping the robotaxis and the humanoid robots with views that were not made by NVIDIA. Jason, Mike, have I overstated that, or how?
No, that's correct. So currently they're AI5 chips. So if you buy a new Tesla today, the hardware version is called hardware version 5, and the chip on that is called AI5. Tesla's had a silicon program since 2018, 2019, somewhere around there. Previous to that, they had the Tesla A100 was in a number of the Tesla vehicles.
It's an NVIDIA chip.
And sorry,
named
NVIDIA.
Tesla.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That is very confusing. Actually, it's a NVIDIA chip that I think actually went by the code name of Tesla. So yeah. Then they hired Jim Keller, right? And Jim Keller, I believe, designed their first version of an in-house piece of silicon for Tesla, and they've evolved that over time. Taiwan Semiconductor is currently manufacturing AI5. I think AI4 might have been back at Samsung. It seems like Elon is basically doing what Jensen used to do and kind of play Samsung and Taiwan Semiconductor off each other. When you're a smaller player, you can do that, and they're sort of in that position, but recognizing that the future, if they do this robotaxi thing and humanoid robots, they can use potentially the same chip across a bunch of different devices. And with semiconductors, one of the coolest things about it is the scale, right? So the more you make, the lower your cost becomes on a per unit basis. And it's just a massively, massively scalable business. So with that, trying to grab capacity from Taiwan Semiconductor is very challenging. This idea of setting up a fab with a company who's struggling to stay on the leading edge is sort of a gamble in some ways, but also ensures that they're going to have a lot more control over the situation. They won't have to fight with NVIDIA, Google, Amazon, all the other customers of Taiwan Semiconductor in order to get capacity. So I think Hunt said it right. This is Elon Musk back at work, and this is going to be very exciting to watch.
Yeah. The thing I would add is it's obviously a win for Samsung, but I think it's a huge loss for Intel. Culturally, I'm not sure they would even entertain a deal where Elon's going to walk the fab production line and kind of tell them how to improve it. But that might be exactly what they've needed. You know, they're going to have a lot of really smart engineers from the Tesla team there to help them optimize production. Intel could certainly use that. It's going to be an asset for Samsung, I think.
Yeah.
We've run through our 30 minutes, but next week, in addition to macro stuff and the software history, we're going to spend some more time on Tesla. What is a 2 million car company, 2 million units a year? I kind of have been thinking they won't be able to do much more than 2 million cars because they're losing the credits in the U.S. China is very competitive against BYD and other Chinese manufacturers. And then Europe, pretty slow and maybe adverse political response to Musk and Musk closest to the Trump administration. However, if, and this is what we'll get into next week, if he can turn out a cheaper Model Y and turn it into robotaxis everywhere, where if the car rolls up to your driveway or your door or outside your apartment building, you can drive it if you want, but you don't need to. And the car has arrived with no driver. This might be very popular. Now, Tesla has protected their balance sheet. As you can see on page 1, they have about $5 billion of debt, and they have about more than $30 billion of cash. I don't expect that will change, but they could set up a new company to own the robotaxis, to buy all these robotaxis. Let's say this time next year they're doing 500,000 units that are going in robotaxis. I mean, there just aren't that many Uber units out. I mean, if this is is this is a consumer item that becomes very popular. They can make a lot of cars, and they can do it with the Model Y, where they are the most efficient car manufacturer in the world, maybe even comparable to BYD. And then we have another page in the back, and I'm going to update these pages over this weekend for DoorDash. How do you think the consumers, all this on the phone, would respond to a robotaxi showing up and a humanoid robot delivering, the food we ordered? I mean, I think if we're looking ahead the next year or two, and probably not more than 2 years, and we're looking for something in addition to the large language models and how they're changing how people work and spend leisure time, this will have an enormous impact. So, but more next week, and we may damp down this enthusiasm quite a lot by next week. But in the meantime, the three of us will visit with each other on it. And we'll be here 7 days from now. Everyone be well and stay healthy. We'll see you in 7 days. Take care.
The views expressed on this podcast are the hosts alone and do not constitute an offer to sell or a recommendation to purchase or a solicitation of an offer to buy any security nor a recommendation for any investment product or service. While certain information contained herein has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, neither the hosts nor any of their employers or their affiliates have independently verified this information, and its accuracy and completeness cannot be guaranteed. Accordingly, no representation or warranty, expressed or implied, is made as to and no reliance should be placed on the fairness, accuracy, timeliness, or completeness of this information. The hosts and all employers and their affiliated persons assume no liability for this information and no obligation to update the information or analysis contained herein in the future and may or may not hold positions in the securities mentioned.